Growing up, pop culture taught me that nuclear waste is green and goopy, that it's haphazardly dumped into our environment.
Well, sir, where should we dump this batch?
The news has told us we should fear it.
A small cup of it would kill everyone in a crowded restaurant in minutes.
And politicians have told us we don't know what to do with it.
Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to add more dangerous waste when we don't know how to get rid of what we have right now.
But most of this isn't really true. The fuel for nuclear power plants is not actually glowing or green. It's somewhat anticlimactically solid gray pellets. And scientists have known the best way to permanently dispose of the most dangerous nuclear waste for more than 50 years. But not a single country in the world has been able to make it happen yet. Instead, it's in temporary storage, which poses a real risk if disaster strikes. Meanwhile, nuclear power plants provide round-the-clock electricity with zero carbon emissions. Meeting climate goals without using nuclear power would be nearly impossible. And AI and data centers are only going to put more pressure on our energy supply. So can we settle the nuclear waste issue once and for all? And is this stuff even waste, or could it be an untapped resource? I spent months interviewing experts to find out the truth. Nuclear power provides nearly a tenth of the world's electricity, and all that comes from a relatively small number of power plants, roughly 400 of them. For comparison, it takes more than 6,000 coal plants to make about a third of the world's electricity. In fact, one small uranium fuel pellet creates about as much energy as 1 ton of coal. These are the fuel for nuclear reactors. To make them, enriched uranium is pressed from a powder form into cylinders and stacked up inside metal rods. Splitting the uranium's atoms apart in a process called fission releases a lot of heat. That turns the water into steam, which spins a turbine, creating electricity. When these fuel rods are freshly made, they're not all that radioactive. You could safely handle them with gloves. But after 3 to 5 years making energy inside a reactor, things change. The used rods release ionizing radiation, and that can be pretty dangerous. High doses of it can kill off cells, damage DNA, and over time cause cancer. Even getting close to used fuel rods right after they come out of a reactor could be deadly. This used fuel is categorized as high-level nuclear waste. But there are other types too. The labels vary by country, but there's also mid-level waste like reactor parts, and low-level waste, which includes protective gear, gloves, coats, and tools used by workers. All these things are considered nuclear waste. But used fuel is by far the most radioactive and the hardest to deal with. The good news is that only about 5% of the waste from nuclear power plants is high level. In fact, if you could take all the high-level waste ever created and put it together, it would fit in one football field to a height of about 10 yards. But even if the waste takes up a lot less space than most people think, we still need to manage it carefully. High-level nuclear waste can stay dangerously radioactive for thousands of years. It may seem impossible to keep something secure for that long, but we do have a pretty clear idea of what needs to be done. And we've actually known for a while. In 1957, a panel of scientists put out a report on radioactive waste that said that long-term, the best option was to dispose of it deep underground, possibly in an old salt mine or some other non-porous cavity. And they had the right idea.
Since that time, every country who has seriously looked at this issue has come to the same conclusion, including up till today. 7
decades later, we still haven't made this happen. Seriously, no one has. 31 countries get electricity from nuclear power plants, and not a single one has actually permanently disposed of its spent nuclear fuel underground. Instead, it's in supposedly temporary storage, mainly above ground, but without a permanent place to go. This is a map of the temporary storage sites in the US that hold spent fuel. Right now, about 1 in 3 Americans live within 50 miles of one. Here's how these facilities work. When fuel is spent, the bundle of rods is removed from the reactor and put into wet storage. These steel-lined pools cover the rods in about 20 feet of water. While the fuel cools down, the water is surprisingly effective at blocking radiation. Theoretically, you might even be able to go swimming at the top of one of these pools and be fine, though I don't recommend it. But if you swam to the bottom and touched the fuel, the dose of radiation would be deadly. But what about living near these storage sites? Experts I spoke to said under normal conditions, living near this type of site is perfectly safe.
We are going to handle this material only in ways that protect workers who are going to be working in close proximity for long periods of time, let alone people in the public who are going to be very far away from these facilities.
But if something went very wrong, like a terrorist attack or a widespread, long-lasting power outage, the pools could lose their water, which would be a big problem.
So the pools come with some risk. Those pools have to be actively cooled. If you walked away from them, that water would eventually boil off, and then you would have a massive meltdown of spent fuel and massive release of radiation.
There are backups to protect these pools in case of emergency. And at this point, the US has done wet storage without incident since the dawn of nuclear power. But just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it never will. No matter what, we need to put used fuel into pools for about a year before it can safely be moved. But with few places to go next, waste tends to stay in these pools a lot longer. And over time, the pools have gotten more crowded, which some experts I spoke with said makes them riskier.
Well, the major risk is because those pools are filled to overcapacity.
Since the US has pretty much jam-packed its wet storage, after about 5 years in the pool, the fuel rods are usually moved to dry storage. That typically means a steel container placed inside a thick concrete one, which provides so much shielding you can safely stand right next to it. The spent fuel rods basically just sit there until the industry and the government decide what to do with them. These facilities also have to be monitored, maintained, and staffed with security. Again, these casks are very secure for the near future, but we don't know exactly how long they'll last before they start to corrode.
It may be 100 years, it may be 200 years, we don't know. Whenever they do break down, somebody, some institution, has to be responsible to move the spent fuel from those broken down casks into new fresh ones, and somebody has to pay for that.
This is one of the big problems with temporary storage, leaving a burden for future generations, from energy consumed long before they were even alive.
You're trusting institutions to take care of the public long into the future. And I have no faith that those institutions will exist or take on that beneficial role.
Even when we shut down an old nuclear plant, the waste has nowhere to go. About 20 sites in the US have been decommissioned but still have their waste sitting there stranded.
It would be nice to turn those places back into usable locales for other things, but you can't move the spent fuel. You can take everything else out.
One controversial example of this is the San Onofre power plant in California. It closed down in 2013, but its waste is still sitting there, nestled between a highway and a beach. Concerns about that site and others in the US ratcheted up in 2011 after a catastrophic tsunami hit a nuclear site in Fukushima, Japan. The main risk here was related to 3 reactors that melted down after the plant lost both main and backup power. There was also a close call with spent fuel stored in pools, but fortunately, the pools didn't lose water fast enough to uncover the rods. During the crisis, workers pumped water through the reactors to cool them down, creating a huge amount of radioactive wastewater. After storing it for 12 years, the plant began gradually releasing filtered and diluted wastewater into the Pacific Ocean. This sparked huge backlash, even though the actual levels of radiation were quite low. One study found you could eat a lifetime's worth of fish caught near this area and still get about as much radiation as one dental X-ray. Nonetheless, Fukushima is a reminder that disaster can strike at nuclear plants. The more waste we have sitting around, the greater the potential risk if that site experiences a natural disaster or terror attack. A deep geological repository could help address a lot of these problems, and it wouldn't require active maintenance. Bury the waste in a deep hole might sound simple, but in practice there's a lot to it. It has to be geologically stable. The rocks should be impermeable, meaning things don't tend to seep in or out. It can't be in a very sensitive ecosystem. The list goes on. The country that's the closest to actually getting it done right now is Finland. Since 2004, Finland has been building what's poised to be the world's first deep geological repository for nuclear waste, aiming to be an example for the whole world. The facility is called Onkalo. It's a network of tunnels drilled into 2 billion-year-old bedrock at a depth of more than 400 meters. spent fuel moves through the tunnels on remote-controlled vehicles. The machine drills a hole for each canister, and each hole is lined with bentonite clay. When this clay comes into contact with water, it expands to form a tight seal, which 1, helps slow water flow around the container, and 2, helps keep it from shifting around inside the rock. The horizontal tunnel above the holes is also backfilled with clay and then topped off with a concrete plug. The whole thing uses the multiple barrier concept. You have secure containers, clay, and the bedrock itself providing layers of protection. Importantly, most of the process can be done by remote control, minimizing workers' exposure to radioactive waste. After about 100 years, Onkalo will be full. At that point, the whole thing will be backfilled and sealed with concrete, and all the structures on top will be taken down. Selecting this location took about 20 years. And part of the reason it was picked is that people who live nearby largely support it. Nuclear waste poses serious risks if handled improperly, and the community has to trust that the government and the companies involved are going to do it right. That was one of the fatal flaws in the US's attempt to build a nuclear waste disposal site. By the 1980s, America had been creating nuclear waste for roughly 40 years, with little regulation guiding how to dispose of it. Most nuclear power plants were storing it on site, and some were starting to run out of room. Besides that, there was also waste piling up from the research, testing, and development of nuclear weapons. According to the EPA, this process left behind more than 100 million gallons of liquid waste, which was a mix of both hazardous chemicals and radioactive materials. The idea of nuclear waste as leaky drums of goop comes in part from this Cold War-era sludge. And images like this one show that it was definitely not always carefully managed. It might have even inspired jokes like this from The Simpsons.
I think it's full, sir.
That's ridiculous. The last tree held 9 drums.
But there are important differences between nuclear weapons waste and nuclear energy waste. The legacy pollution from making atomic bombs was created during an arms race, where the priorities were speed and secrecy. The used fuel from modern nuclear power plants comes from a very different, much more regulated system. Regardless, by the 80s, we had a pileup on our hands. To address it, Congress passed the Nuclear Waste Policy Act in 1982. Its goal was to create a roadmap for permanent underground disposal of high-level radioactive waste. It tasked the Department of Energy with studying 10 potential sites. Then, 5 years later, Congress changed its mind and picked just one site to assess, a remote spot on Yucca Mountain in Nevada.
You shouldn't have Congress selecting sites for nuclear waste disposal. They are not a scientific body. They are a political body. And that's when things went wrong.
Nevada and Yucca Mountain already had an eventful history with nuclear technology. The US government tested nuclear weapons there, a lot of them. From 1951 to 63, about 100 atomic blasts took place at the Nevada test site. These sent radioactive particles high into the atmosphere, which fell back down to Earth, contaminating land, air, and water.
A new term, fallout, the radioactive dust which descends upon the Earth after the big blasts, has occupied citizens and the press. There has been some exaggeration, says the Atomic Energy Commission. The tests do not produce dangerous fallout.
Unfortunately, they very much did. The Nevada test site contains some of the most radioactive land in the world, according to the Atomic Heritage Foundation. It's contaminated with substances linked to thyroid cancer and birth defects. So many Nevadans weren't thrilled to hear they'd been selected for nuclear waste disposal. 3 decades later, communities were still resisting the project and politicians were still fighting about it.
Yucca Mountain is dead, and Nevada will not be our nation's nuclear waste dump.
If you generate nuclear waste, you should keep it in your own backyard.
Today, the Yucca Mountain repository is indefinitely paused, and experts I spoke with said there's very little chance it will move forward. Before its funding was frozen in 2011, the government had already spent a huge amount of money on the project, including boring tunnels into the rock where researchers studied the site. CBS News called it a $19 billion hole in the ground. That was taxpayer money. But to make matters worse, the federal government had also been collecting another type of payment. Starting in the early 80s, nuclear power plant operators paid a fee per unit of electricity they made, which they passed on to customers' electricity bills. Over the years, it added up to almost $50 billion. The promise was that the government would use that fund to build new systems and start taking the waste away from the plants in 1998, which of course, it hasn't done. The Department of Energy was still collecting about $750 million a year in 2013 when a federal court ruled it had to stop. But now, this issue is costing taxpayers again. Because the government didn't fulfill its end of the deal, it's paying penalties to the nuclear industry every year it fails to take away the waste. $11 billion so far, with an estimated $44 billion in future costs. And the government is apparently not yet investigating alternative sites either.
The current law of the land is that the United States has Yucca Mountain as its chosen selected disposal site. Until you make that final decision, either move forward or strike it for future consideration, everything else is jammed up.
What's really interesting here is that the US actually does have a deep repository for nuclear waste, the only working one in the world, and the community actually volunteered to host it. But it doesn't take used fuel at all, only waste from weapons production. A 1992 law specifically banned it from taking reactor fuel, which was more controversial at the time. Meanwhile, the US makes about 2,000 metric tons of used fuel each year, and with nowhere for it to go, most plants continue to store it on site. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission says nuclear plants are running out of room, and that the US now needs to add more temporary storage sites. Not so shockingly, states have fought back against hosting those facilities because without any plan for disposal, people are skeptical that these sites will actually be temporary. In June of this year, the Supreme Court ruled against the states, clearing the way for more temporary storage. These endless political hangups are in large part because people fear nuclear waste. But the irony here is that our current system puts more people close to it and keeps it less secure. Meanwhile, some people argue it actually isn't waste at all, because it's possible to reuse it. Spent rods actually still have about 90% of their energy locked inside them, and it's possible to recover some of that energy. Media coverage often calls this recycling, although that sort of glosses over how complex this process is. First, the fuel still has to cool down in a pool. Then those rods are disassembled and sliced into smaller pieces before being dissolved in a solution of nitric acid. A series of chemical reactions separates out the useful elements from everything else. The useful end products are uranium and plutonium, which both need additional processing before they can be used again. Plutonium mixed with uranium can become something called mixed oxide or MOX fuel, which can go back into nuclear reactors. With uranium and plutonium separated out, what remains is a radioactive mixture of chemicals and metals. This is still high-level waste and needs to be managed carefully. Usually, it's vitrified, which means encased in glass, before it can head to long-term disposal. So there's still waste from this process. It's not perfectly circular. But depending on the specific reprocessing technique, it can also make the waste radioactive for less time. You can see here we could be talking about less than 1,000 years, instead of the 250,000 years it takes when nuclear fuel is used only once. And of course, recovering uranium from the fuel rods means you can mine less new uranium. The problem here is that uranium is quite cheap. So going through all this effort to reuse it is actually more expensive.
That's one of the big misconceptions, is that somehow if I reprocess that it's gonna save me money. It's not.
Some experts I spoke with said reprocessing can reduce the cost of disposal because you end up with less waste by volume, meaning a smaller repository. But you can't save money on something if you're not doing it yet, which makes it a tough sell in the US.
While reprocessing has a lot of attractiveness, and I would support it, without that back-end cost offset, it just doesn't make any economic sense at this point in time.
Others I spoke to strongly opposed reprocessing altogether.
It's getting a lot of political traction, and it shouldn't. We have plenty of uranium. There is no need to reprocess. It's a complete boondoggle.
To be clear, there's lots of uranium in the Earth's crust, but it has to be enriched to be used in reactors. The US doesn't do much of that and relies mainly on imports instead. But experts I spoke with raised another concern. Reprocessing separates the plutonium out of fuel rods. It can be reused in fuel, but if it's not, having a stockpile of plutonium on hand creates a pathway to making more nuclear weapons. This concern is actually why the US doesn't reuse its nuclear fuel. In 1977, the US was doing some reprocessing, but President Jimmy Carter shut it down, saying we could have a viable and economic nuclear power program without it. The idea was to prevent the global spread of technology that could lead to more nuclear weapons. Today, the debate about reprocessing and nuclear weapons proliferation is still not settled. France is the world's leading nuclear waste reprocessor, and a fascinating case study. Orano, the state-owned company that processes the used fuel, is now the world's third largest producer of uranium. Although France reuses less than half of the uranium it recovers as fuel, and stockpiles the rest. And it makes use of the plutonium, transporting it 800 kilometers to the south of France, where it's turned into MOX fuel. But again, there's a catch. Even with all this effort, France is still making more plutonium than it can reuse. The country's inventory of plutonium has been growing for the last 2 decades. Critics of reprocessing point out that the more we lean into this technology, the more the world's supply of separated plutonium could grow. And over long periods, we don't know whether our current safeguards and institutions will remain in place. Basically, you can go back and forth on reprocessing all day. The US has so much waste in storage that reprocessing it would power the entire country for 100 years, but doing so would cost about $100 billion, and so on and so on. The discourse about this tends to assume we need to settle the reprocessing question before figuring out disposal. But crucially, we don't. We need repositories for disposal either way. On that, the experts I spoke with all agreed.
You see a lot of people talking about trying to do reprocessing, but nobody talks about disposal.
There are a number of people out there saying that this is the answer to nuclear waste. We don't need a repository. That is flat out a lie.
Despite this, the Trump administration is pursuing reprocessing without making any clear plans for disposal. A new generation of startups are also showing interest in reusing nuclear fuel. A startup called Onkalo recently announced plans for a reprocessing facility in Tennessee, which it says will produce fuel for its microreactors. Another startup, Curio, says its process can recover not only uranium and plutonium, but also valuable metals like rhodium and palladium. These technologies fall under the umbrella of advanced nuclear, a broad term that basically just means technology that's substantially different from the reactors we have today. Some companies in this space have promoted their tech by saying it won't create as much nuclear waste. But unfortunately, that isn't necessarily true. Studies have had mixed results, but most find these new designs will produce the same or even more waste per unit of energy as today's reactors. This problem is simply not going away. And in case you're watching this and thinking, wow, I don't like the sound of any of this, maybe we should just stop using nuclear power altogether. Know that even that wouldn't solve this issue. When you shut down a nuclear power plant, you have to decommission it. And all that fuel plus the reactor itself becomes waste that has to be disposed of. Of course, context is key here. Every form of energy leaves solid waste behind. Burning coal produces toxic coal ash. Refining oil leaves behind sludge. Wind turbines have giant, hard-to-recycle fiberglass blades, and so on. This report compared various industries based on how much radioactive waste they leave behind. You can see a number of industries beat out nuclear, including coal, oil, gas, and, interestingly, water treatment. Coal ash, by the way, is also radioactive, because coal naturally contains thorium and uranium, and when it's burned up for energy, those radioactive elements become more concentrated in the ash that's left over. All around us, the world is full of natural and unnatural sources of radiation, like the sun, airport scanners, and X-rays and medical treatments. This report looked at the baseline dose of radiation that we all get just from walking around, and then broke it down by source. The green rectangle on top is the dose from medical sources. The red one on the bottom is background radiation from the natural environment. And these very small blocks up on top are the dose we get from nuclear waste and nuclear power. So we know the health risks of nuclear waste have been relatively well managed so far. The big question is, how do we make sure that future humans can and will continue to manage the risk? Because nothing is going to save us from the need for permanent disposal. Not recycling, not shutting it all down, and not newer, more high-tech reactors. Which makes it all the more frustrating that the US government seems to have this near the bottom of its priority list. The Trump administration gutted the Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board, a nonpartisan board of experts that gave advice on dealing with this waste. even as the US and other countries declare they're tripling nuclear energy by 2050. There are valid critiques of nuclear power, including its cost and the time to build it, but that's a subject for another video. For now, what's very clear is that when it comes to nuclear waste, it's time to stop kicking the can down the road. If you're curious about the sources for this video, I made a reading list for you, and it's linked in the video description below.